I thought that Christian faith, was for another time, or for people who are not as well educated, and as intelligent as me and my friends. I thought that was intelligence. Of course, it's just following the herd, as I recognize now. And I thought, we were too intelligent to need that sort of thing. Maybe it's okay for you if you can't get along without it. That's the patronizing attitude that the intellectuals tend to have towards the ordinary people. But then I went through life.
I learned that all life forms basically were derived from a simple beginning type of life, and we just evolved up to where we are now.
I went to high school in New York City, Manhattan, Upper East Side, Jesuit high school, about as far away from Dayton, Tennessee as you could possibly be in every sense of the word. In our high school, evolution wasn't an issue, it was a given.
The thought was that natural selection, chance mechanisms cause life and its diversity. I came to believe that myself in college. I thought that the first two chapters of the Bible were some kind of a myth and fictitious.
Everyone treated evolution as though it were fact. I cannot say that it was oppressive or obsessive or even much dwelt upon. I think the movie Inherit the Wind probably had more influence on kids of my generation than did the science curriculum.
In my biology classes, there was just kind of an assumption that complicated organisms evolved from single-celled organisms.
Well, like everyone, I think I learned that, man was coming from the ape, and that was a common point for all scientists, and that probably we should not discuss even the problem.
Hi, I'm Woody Kozad. I'm a lawyer. And I'm a lawyer because at the impressionable age of 12 years, I received a gift from my mother, this book, Attorney for the Damned, The Closing Arguments of the Great Clarence Darrow. Moved by the brilliance of those arguments, I decided I wanted to grow up and be a lawyer like Darrow. But I didn't absorb much of his politics. As a matter of fact, the only idea I really learned from Darrow was that when everyone, absolutely everyone, in every suburb and country club and college in America believes something to be true, true beyond question, then probably it isn't. We all have much to learn and unlearn, and little time for either. So questions as to how old the earth is or how young, or how the Bible should be read or shouldn't, these we'll leave for other wiser souls. The one question we have before us is question enough. Just who or what is responsible for the creation and development of life on earth? To help guide us, we are honored to have Philip Johnson, professor of law at the University of California, Berkeley, author of Darwin on Trial, among other breakthrough books, and national leader of the intelligent design movement.
In the 19th century, when Darwin was writing and studying, It was in the period after the Enlightenment, which started in France and came through Europe. And the Enlightenment was an idea, basically, that we will replace these different religious traditions and denominations that have caused so much trouble and war with a universal human reason that's available to everybody, and that does not involve God, because the different views of God had caused these different religions and all the conflict that stemmed from them. To get God out of the picture altogether, they needed a creation story, particularly a story of how these wondrous things we call living organisms came into existence. So Darwin's theory fit into that intellectual program.
In 1859, Charles Darwin published The Origin of Species. This elegant and timely work makes two basic claims. One is that living things experience what Darwin called variations, or what we call mutations, genetic changes that occur randomly. The second is that a process he called natural selection preserves favorable variations and rejects harmful ones. According to Darwin, these changes are infinitesimally small. Said he, that natural selection will always act with extreme slowness, I fully admit. This theory of evolution is often referred to, in total, as descent with modification. The best evidence Darwin could cite for this theory was the breeding of dogs and other domesticated animals. These obvious changes within a species, called microevolution, no one could deny then and no one denies today. The question Darwin had to ask himself, the tough question, was whether this theory could account for macroevolution, the presumed bridge from one species to another, and the mechanism he thought responsible for the vast diversity of life.
Darwin said, well, yes, we can do that job. We have domestic animal breeding. We breed dogs and cattle and sheep, and especially pigeons. He was interested in pigeons. And you get these fantastically different shapes and sizes by selective breeding of these animals. So if we can do this in a short period of time, a century or so, think what nature could do if it had a much longer time available for it. And so the project came to be to explain how nature could do all of this. And Darwin suggested the only halfway plausible mechanism anybody has ever suggested for how this job could be done without God playing a part in it.
To illustrate Darwin's theory, Richard Dawkins, today's most influential evolutionist, considers the human eye. He starts by imagining the simplest of living creatures, the proud possessor of a light-sensitive spot. A random mutation, X, occurs, and that makes that spot a wee bit more sensitive. This extra sensitivity gives the creature a leg up in the survival game. He passes the genetic variation on to his offspring, and they pass future variations on to theirs. Dawkins asks, is there a continuous series of X's connecting the modern eye to a state with no eye at all? His answer is, of course, yes. Better eyes make for a better chance at survival, or so it's argued. But who or what drives this seemingly miraculous development? Richard Dawkins answers, natural selection. What he calls a blind, unconscious, automatic process that is the explanation for the existence and apparently purposeful form of all life. That's a quote. The explanation. All life. What room does that leave for, well, say God? Not much. In The Evolutionary Pattern of Thought, said Julian Huxley on the occasion of the Darwin Centennial in 1959, there is no longer either need or room for the supernatural. The earth was not created, it evolved. No need, no room. And Huxley's sentiment is the rule, not the exception. The renowned biologist Stephen Jay Gould praises Darwinism as a rigidly materialistic and basically atheistic version of evolution. Darwin made it possible, boasts Richard Dawkins, to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. These are their own words. Listen, for instance, as Cornell University professor Will Provine, evolutionary biologist and neo-Darwinian, addresses the issue of what Darwin learned and what he has passed on to this generation.
He gradually came to understand that the implications of his conception of evolution were profound and not only difficult for him to accept, but impossible for him to reject. And let's see what they are. First, the argument from design fails. There are no intelligent designers visible in the natural world. When mammals die, they are really and truly dead. No ultimate foundations for ethics exists, no ultimate meaning in life exists, and free will is merely a human myth. These are all conclusions to which Darwin came quite clearly. Modern evolutionary biology not only supports Darwin's belief in evolution by descent and his belief in natural selection, but all of the implications that Darwin saw in evolution have been strongly supported by modern evolutionary biology.
The larger philosophy is often called naturalism. Nature is all that there is. Or materialism, matter is all that there is.
Now, after the triumph of Darwinism, the philosophy that came to dominate was naturalism. And a scientific naturalist doesn't talk about God or think about God because we can't have any knowledge about God, and so there's no point in talking or thinking about it. It would be just useless speculation. So Thomas Henry Huxley, Darwin's first and most important disciple, coined the term agnostic to mean a person who knows that we can never have knowledge of God. See, an agnostic is not an open-minded inquirer, it's sometimes portrayed that way, but that's false. An agnostic is a person who knows for sure that we cannot have knowledge of God, so he doesn't look for it. And what the scientific naturalist says is not God does not exist. See, that gives him too much dignity to think that he might exist. What you say is we have no need for that hypothesis. We can explain everything without it. So you can believe in God if you want to do that sort of thing, but it's sort of like believing in the Tooth Fairy or Santa Claus.
In its most extreme forms, scientific naturalism provided a rationale for the terror of Nazi eugenics and the tyranny of communism. Wrote Marx to Engels of Darwin's The Origin of Species, this is the book which contains the basis in natural history for our view. Today, naturalism quietly rules in science education. Although there are at least two schools of Darwinist thought, what binds them together, Dawkins boasts, is that they both, quote, despise so-called scientific creationists equally.
Intellectual work has to be done on the basis of naturalism. So it's certainly possible to be a devout, God-fearing, God-believing, good works doing Christian and to be a Darwinist. What it isn't possible to do is to take your God-based beliefs and bring them into the university world, into the intellectual world, and have them treated with anything but indifference.
The reign of naturalism, however, may be coming to an end. Ironically, the more nature reveals of itself, the more doubt is cast on the mechanics of Darwinism and the naturalist assumptions that support it. Life seems not to be the result of an accident after all, but rather of an inspiration.
I was reading Charles Fort's critique of evolution. Charles Fort was roughly the 19th century equivalent of Art Bell, oddly, and he pointed out that the theory was tautological in terms of its predictive powers. What it said was that survivors survive. Well, that's a very useful thing to know. Can you look at a population and determine which of them are going to survive? It It's really a sideshow from the point of view of science because it doesn't do the main thing that you expect science to do, which is predict repeatable results.
Actually, I do remember the exact day that it hit me that there's a huge difference between monkeys and people. And that made a big difference. Just all of a sudden, it was just too much to accept that this is just a gradual change.
One of my listeners to my radio show gave me a book. It's called Darwin on Trial. It's by Mr. Philip Johnson, whom I'd never heard of. I was so little interested in the subject, I threw it in the trunk of my car. A little while after, I took my kids to the Renaissance Festival. I got stuck out there for 4 hours drinking like a 96-ounce Diet Coke. I rummaged through my trunk. I found Darwin on Trial. It was the only book I had. I read it from cover to cover. And after that, everything's been different.
I think one reason I didn't become a geologist is that I really didn't feel comfortable with a conclusion that the diversity we're looking at in organisms and also the fossil record was consistent with a chance mechanism.
Well, actually, I then start studying this question of evolution, and I discovered that actually it was not based on very sound scientific proof. And then little by little, I discovered that behind this was a whole outlook of life, philosophy that will try to explain the existence of the world without God.
You look at the airplane, and it's obviously designed. But then you look at the bird and what the bird can do that the airplane can't hope to do. I mean, it can feed itself, it can repair itself, it preens its own wings, it reproduces, it feeds its young. It does functions that the airplane will never be able to do. And so how can we assume that that was not designed too when it's so infinitely more complex?
Stephen Jay Gould speaks of those honest moments when evolutionists, like himself, are forced to question the very theories on which they have built their reputations. Darwin had many such moments. Why, he asked, if species have descended from other species by insensibly fine gradations, do we not see everywhere innumerable transitional forms? Good question, but Darwin had no good answer. There were no transitional forms to be seen. Still, he presumed that if existing life did not prove him right, the fossil record surely would. It has not. The extreme rarity of transitional forms in the fossil record, admits Gould in an honest moment, is the trade secret of paleontology. Adds Philip Johnson, the outstanding characteristic of the fossil record is the absence of evidence for evolution.
Now, if you ask why the Darwinists are so sure it's true, there are two kinds of reasons that can be given. First is philosophical. They believe that nature did its own creating. There's no God around to become involved, no creator, no intelligence. So you have to start with the simplest forms of life and then have them evolve into the more complex ones. So bacteria just have to be able to evolve into plants and animals and human beings, because otherwise you wouldn't have plants and animals and human beings. It's as simple as that. It's the only possibility. The other explanation is that they will tell you that there are certain common features throughout life. There are certain chemical processes that are standard in the bacteria and that are also present in the human beings and in the plants and animals. Now that's perfectly true, but of course that's an observation. It doesn't give you an explanation for the observation. For example, if all of these things are created by God, you would expect that they would also have common features. You see, the common features here trace back to a common creator. But the Darwinists rule that creator out of existence by philosophical assumption. And so, in a way, the second reason is the same as the first. Because the creator is out of the picture, the only conceivable explanation for the common features is naturalistic evolution.
Imagine if a forensic scientist accepted only naturalist explanations. When he sees a hole in a victim's head, 0.45 inches in diameter, he says, I wonder what act of nature could blow open so round a hole. Darwinist assumptions are often just as forced.
Richard Dawkins tells the story of the bats in The Blind Watchmaker. And he says, well, how did flight evolve? Imagine this. You have a climbing creature, a small squirrel-like creature that's climbing in the trees, and it jumps from branch to branch, and every so often it falls. Now, when it falls, it's killed. But if it happened by mutation to develop a little flap between its digits, this would slow the fall slightly. And so the creature is able to reproduce, it has offspring, and it passes its genes on. So the offspring have that flap too. And the flap gets bigger with another mutation, and that's even more advantageous when they fall because it slows the flight, and so on and so forth until you get wings to fly. Now this is what is called, sarcastically, a just so story. After the animal fables by Rudyard Kipling, you know, how the tiger got his stripes, how the elephant got his trunk, how the monkey got his tail, or whatever, that it's a fable. It's a fable with no scientific evidence behind it at all. As far as the fossil record goes, bats have always been bats. They haven't gone through any of these changes. And when you think about the story, it's ridiculous. In the first place, there's a whole lot more to wings and flight than having flaps between your digits. You have to have a whole body that's reconstructed for the purpose of flight. And of course, while this body was in the intermediate stages of being reconstructed for flight, it would probably be much less efficient as a squirrel body. So you lose efficiency in the middle stages. Darwinists can say, well, you can't prove that. And indeed, you can't prove it because there's no evidence that ever went through the stages, you see. So since the whole process is imaginary, you can imagine anything you like.
There are billions and billions of such just so stories, one for every living thing, one more fantastic than the other.
Another kind of example you'll see is with the whale. You see, with its body, with its special kind of tail, with its special kind of breathing equipment, with its special kind of reproducing equipment. See, a whale needs all of these things before it makes any sense in its role as this seagoing mammal that is way out in the ocean and suckles its young underwater and all those sorts of things. So to think of an animal, you know, sort of bumping along the trail, partway between being an ungulate, they call it, like a cow, and a whale, is an absurdity. Now, Darwinists will say it isn't, and they'll say it's because, well, we have this creature that was a whale that had certain appendages, you see, so maybe that's something in between. They're very easily satisfied by fragmentary evidence because they know it all has to be true anyway, just because of the philosophy, so they never question their basic commitment.
Or consider the eye once again. Most primitive eye forms remain just as primitive as they were eons ago. The more advanced ones are not just more complex than the primitive ones. They differ radically in structure and biochemistry. There is no conceivable bridge from one to another, and even 95% of an eye can do its host no good. More troubling for Darwinists than the evidence that does not exist is the evidence that does. Darwin predicted that from a single ancestor, many life forms would follow in gradual, continuous diversification. The fossil record suggests just the opposite, dramatically so. During the Cambrian era, there emerged in a geological eye blink virtually all major animal groups. In one of his honest moments, Richard Dawkins says, "It was as though they were just planted there, without any evolutionary history." Maybe they were. Now remember that downward curve. Darwin predicted that the extinction of a species would be even slower than its production. Well, the fossil evidence suggests that extinctions were quick and catastrophic. In one of his honest moments, Gould calls these mass dyings anomalous and threatening. Threatening, I guess, to his theories. Surely the evidence for human evolution is stronger than it is for animals. Perhaps not.
I have a tendency to distrust the entire field of human evolution, or paleoanthropology as it's called by the scientists. And the reason is there's too much subjectivity. That even the accounts of it by the scientists say that they yearn to cradle their ancestors in their hands. Well, somebody who's cradling his ancestor in his hands is not being scientifically objective. It's an area where, because you can take a bone and tell a story from the bone of change, subjective imagination rules over scientific objectivity. And these people are all philosophically convinced that the theory has to be true from the beginning. So I don't know whether some parts of it might be true. See, that biased people can sometimes find good evidence. So you can't say the theory is proved false by all this. What you can say is that it's proved untrustworthy.
The desperate search for human ancestors has led to some curious finds.
The Piltdown Man incident occurred in the early 20th century. And the Darwinists at that time were really desperate to find something that would confirm their theory. They had Archaeopteryx for the origin of birds. That was something. But they really needed something for the origin of man. So, in fact, some of them went fossil hunting, and an amateur named Dawson found some bones in southern England. Father Teilhard de Chardin, the Jesuit priest who was big on human evolution, got involved. And they put together this Piltdown Man, which supposedly showed parts of the head of a creature which was ape-like in terms of its walking, but developing, you see, a human cranium and becoming a human being. And that was a human ancestor. That was Piltdown Man. Now, later on, it was discovered the whole thing was a fraud. The bones were stained and filed and put together. It was a conscious fraud. Nobody knows exactly who was responsible or how many people were responsible. But the important thing is that the whole scientific community wanted so desperately to believe that they swallowed it whole without any, careful examination. It told the story they wanted to tell. And so it gave 40 years of useful service in convincing people around the world that the story was true.
Do you know how the New York Times headlined the initial discovery of the Piltdown Man? Darwin Theory is proved true. Yes, even then, the media were suckers for politically correct junk science. Okay, let's sum up what the Darwinists tell us in their honest moments. There's no evidence of existing transitional species. There's no hard evidence in the fossil record. Most species haven't changed at all. The major animal groups exploded onto the scene, and those that vanished in a heartbeat. All this evidence runs counter to Darwin's theories, and it gets worse.
If you want to think about how complex the cell is and how interrelated its parts, you might think about a city. Think about New York City or any great manufacturing place where you have superhighways coming in and out and transportation systems that bring materials to the factories and that take the parts for assembly and then take the finished product out to be used. A cell is like that because it's like a sort of chemical factory of great intricacy that has to do an enormous number of things, and it has to get the right parts in the right place and send coded instructions and coordinate instantaneously all these tremendously complex things.
In one of his bolder moments, Darwin said, if it could be demonstrated that any complex organ existed, which could not possibly have been formed by numerous successive slight modifications, my theory would absolutely break down. Darwin knew nothing of electron microscopes and cellular biology. His champion, Richard Dawkins, knows a lot. As Dawkins notes, the nucleus of each cell contains more information than all 30 volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica put together, complex, specific, and perfectly ordered. Dawkins doesn't have a clue where these first encyclopedias came from. Neither do his peers. Indeed, when biochemist Michael Behe searched the scientific journals looking for an explanation, He found instead an eerie and complete silence.
You know, the Darwinists don't really make a serious effort to explain that. See, they try to tell these just-so stories about how the bat got its wings, you see, how the fish got its flippers, and so on. But they aren't really scientific at all, because they're not connected to the underlying biochemical mechanisms that would have to be at work if all of this were to be done. So how these things get put together, how they get created, how they get designed, is a great mystery. And I don't know if we could ever solve it or not, but there's not a prayer of solving it, not a chance, as long as you have this ideological position that says we have to stick to the 19th century solution. We can't afford to admit that it's inadequate, because then we'd lose our prestige, then we'd have trouble. We want to have everybody believing we've had the problem solved all along. So we have to free up science so that it can look at this wonderful, complex world as it really is.
Richard Dawkins imagines the cell as a Xerox machine, capable, he says, of copying its own blueprints, but not capable of springing spontaneously into existence. So picture, on the brink of infinity, this wonderfully complex machine. Beside it, Richard Dawkins, pumping what Darwin called secretions from his barely evolved brain, trying desperately to figure how this machine came to be. His best guess? No joke. Sheer, unadulterated, miraculous luck. It must have slopped itself together, he surmises, from some imagined chemical soup. Luck indeed. It's a task scientists have never been able to duplicate in the lab. Not to be outdone, Nobel laureate Francis Crick argues that these first primitive life forms might have come to Earth, hang on, in a spaceship, sent by a dying alien civilization. Oh?
So the story doesn't make any sense, and anyway, there isn't any evidence for it. It's entirely imaginary. The only reason that anybody would believe it is that what else are you going to believe if you rule God out of the picture?
Says Darwin, I would give nothing for the theory of natural selection if it requires miraculous additions at any one stage of descent. Neither would we.
In high school, the Darwinists want to teach the kids first that evolution is a fact. They'll teach that in the grade school, as a matter of fact. They want to get them thinking evolution is a fact at the earliest moment. Then as time goes on, they develop more and more of what that word evolution means. You see, at first you might say, oh, we're just talking about finch beak variation, we're just talking about dog breeding, mosquitoes becoming resistant to DDT. That's all very innocent stuff. Later on, they will tell you that word means the whole creation story. An unguided, purposeless material process did all the creating, and God had nothing to do with it. Now, see, this message then naturally means, of course, that God's moral authority has no effect.
In the late 20th century, Darwinists presumed that everyone, except those Dawkins calls the ignorant, stupid, insane, or wicked, believed in the evolutionary theories they believed in. Confidently, they began to push Darwin in the public schools until the people of America began to push back. One place they pushed back hard was Kansas.
The committee that was put together by the commissioner was a state committee of 27, mostly educators. That group put together a document that was very, very heavily weighted with evolution.
And we got our first draft back in the first of the year, and at that time when I first saw it, I was concerned because evolution was presented dogmatically, and it was presented as a unifying concept that without it you cannot study any of science. And as a matter of fact, one of the writers told me that evolution is a fact. It is beyond investigation. And at that point in time, I decided that something needed to be done. I tried to talk to them and say, why don't we talk about some of the problems associated with it? You know, I mean, I don't mind studying evolution. I've studied it myself for a lot of years, read a lot of stuff about it. And yet, it looks to me like there's some data that would seem to indicate that there are some problems with the theory. Therefore, I've made that presentation, made that suggestion, and it didn't go anywhere. At that point in time, a group of people came to me and said, how about let's talk about writing some of the standards? And that's when I said, you bet, let's go for it.
Abrams first proposed to have intelligent design and Darwinism taught side by side. Not finding a majority on the board, he offered a compromise, which would remove macroevolution from state tests and leave the teaching of it to the school districts.
I don't have a problem with what they call microevolution, the variation within the species, those things that we have observed, the peppered moths, the finch beaks, so forth, that we've seen in response to the environment. What I don't see evidence for is the macroevolution where the dinosaur turned into the bird, or one of the latest ones I've heard is that a cow turned into a whale sometime over time. I've also seen the one where a canine-looking creature turned into something that looked kind of like a porpoise. And these are things that really are in imagination, but not proof that I can tell. Nothing that's verifiable.
We still brought in and talked about microevolution, bacteria evolving, changing, adapting, if you will, into other bacteria. We believe that occurs. As a veterinarian, I see it as a citizen of Kansas, that where we deal with cattle breeding and wheat seed breeding all the time. It's an important factor, and so it's obviously something that needs to be dealt with. Consequently, we still did leave it in there. That's microevolution. Macroevolution we left out.
Governor Bill Graves called this modest proposal a tragic, terrible, embarrassing solution to a problem that did not have to exist. He wasn't alone in his hysteria.
It just simply threw a frightful panic into the science educators, the Darwinian establishment, and the newspaper editorialists. Thundering denunciations came from all the big cities and from Europe, from London. You would think that the newspaper editors in all those cities had nothing more to worry about than the details of curriculum in the high schools of Kansas.
Governor Graves and I obviously disagree on that, and I believe his proposal was to do away with an elected board and go to a board appointed by the governor. Our board is reflective of the communities in Kansas, and it's just this messy representative process that we're dealing with right now. We don't have groupthink anymore.
What's interesting to me is that the liberal extreme on this side is really pretty, they're just not as tolerant as they always claim to be. They cannot present their theory of evolution without taking a swipe at religion. And I don't know why, you know, you'd think they'd be capable of doing that, but they're not.
I like observation, measuring, you know, prove it to me kind of stuff. And so when I see evidence against evolution, it's not being, you know, allowed to be considered in classes. I know that, you know, I feel like I've been naive all my life. It's a disappointment that that's happening here in America.
Kansas is a big area for local control, as you're probably aware, and as such, we thought this was a good way to handle it, to allow local boards of education, those closest to the parents, those closest to the citizens involved in the issue, to decide how they wanted to handle it. My hope and expectation is that it will be handled. I hope that they do teach evolution.
More and more people understand the score, and they understand how to put their case in the right way. What has really held back sound public consideration of this issue is what I call the inherit the wind stereotype. That comes from the play, a movie, it's been made in many different forms. Inherit the Wind, which is a fictional and a very distorted propagandistic view of the Scopes trial of 1925. To put it very simply, the Scopes trial actually was just a publicity stunt. Nobody was at risk. But it's turned in the movie into a persecution of a teacher for teaching evolution. And it's a movie in which the Christians, you see, the Bible believers, are in every respect evil, ignorant, and nasty, and in which the scientific investigators have every virtue. So it's a black and white situation, and it's used as an effective propaganda ploy. And see, when this subject comes up as a controversy, when somebody says, we want fair-minded teaching of evolution, not dogmatic teaching, the reporters will say, religious fundamentalists are trying to censor science education. And they'll tell the story of the Scopes trial, but not the true story. They'll tell the inherit the wind story. The story is always religious fundamentalists threaten open-minded science investigation. Now, the truth is just about completely opposite to that.
In high school, mind you, I had the fun of playing Attorney Henry Drummond, the Clarence Darrow figure in Inherit the Wind, the fair-minded champion of tolerance, justice, and of course, Darwinism. In a critical scene, having gotten my foolish Christian opponent to admit that he'd never read Darwin, I laid into him big time. Then how in perdition do you have the gall to whoop up this holy war against something you don't know anything about? How can you be so cocksure that the body of scientific knowledge systematized in the writings of Charles Darwin is in any way irreconcilable with the spirit of the book of Genesis? Darwin, Darrow, reconcilable? The champions of Darwin praise his work as a universal acid that corrodes traditional morality and religion. The real Clarence Darrow denounces Christianity as a slave religion. And our kids are supposed to believe that there's no conflict here?
I tell parents that the worst thing that they can do is to try to shield their children from knowledge of the Darwinian system, knowledge of what the biologists are saying about evolution. Because you see, then they get into high school or college and they're told about it, they haven't heard about it at home, and it blows them away. Why didn't my parents, why didn't my church tell me about this? I wasn't prepared to deal with it. So I say what we have to do is to teach the young people a great deal more about evolution than the science educators want them to know. When you look at nature, what we see are the surface manifestations. We see these creatures that are beautifully adapted to their environment, that are able to work in a way together in a complex ecosystem. And you know that removal of any one feature is apt to cause a crash in the system as a whole, because something else will get out of phase and you'll have some disaster. It's a picture of things working wondrously together. Competition is part of it. That's what the Darwinists describe. But competition is only a part, and in fact there are many biologists who stress the cooperation that is seen between the various elements of nature. But certainly what I see is the product of a marvelous creative mind.
Darwinists would have us believe that for billions of years the vast spectacle of life passed by without a thought, because man had not yet emerged to think one. The evidence suggests otherwise. The evidence suggests that in the beginning was indeed the Word.
Now what we find is that in fact information, the product of intelligence, had to be present all along. It had to be injected from some source, and it doesn't come from the mindless motions of matter or natural selection or anything like that. And indeed, I've been now starting to read articles where some of our cosmologists and physicists are speculating that information came first and that matter is congealed information. And so what the whole movement of science is toward, whether Darwinian scientists recognize it or not, mostly they don't, is towards the fact that indeed information is primary. So when you say in the beginning was the Word, That's true scientifically, especially since there is no known information creating biological process. You see, you just don't have any clear-cut examples of any processes that can create information at all, much less create information on the stupendous scale that it would have to do in order to be responsible for biological creation.
Richard Dawkins admits that the beauty and elegance of biological design gives us the illusion of design and planning. But trapped by a lifetime of scornful pride and self-congratulation, he and his fellow Darwinists hang on to their weary 19th century materialism as stubbornly as the Soviets hung on to theirs, even as the evidence mounts against it.
I think one of the most powerful examples that I've ever seen comes from my colleague Michael Behe, the biochemist who has written about the irreducible complexity of living things. And Behe illustrates this with the bacterial flagellum. The flagellum is sort of like a whip, you flagellate. It's a little stringy thing that vibrates, and the bacteria can do all sorts of wonderful things with that, like it fills various functions, but particularly a transport. It's a sort of a propeller. And it's got a wheel-like arrangement with very complex, intermeshing parts that have to work together. And you can see this in an illustration, in a demonstration, and you can understand how all of the parts have to be present at the same time. Clearly, the bacterial flagellum and countless other organs of the body, not just in humans, but in bacteria, in all creatures, are the kinds of things that can only be made by intelligence.
Over the past 4 decades, writes Michael Behe in Darwin's Black Box, modern biochemistry has uncovered the secrets of the cell. The result, he adds, is a loud, piercing cry of design.
When I see the universe, I look at it, I really think that the whole show was created for us. I have this instinct that that's the way it is. And the more I read, the more reinforced I am in that belief. That's not to say that if a flying saucer lands in my backyard, I'm going to disbelieve it. But until that time comes, I believe that we're the show. I believe that God created the world for us, and we better do our best with it because we may not get another chance.
To me, when you see design in nature, you observe that design, this incredible sophistication and complexity. There can't be any other answer to the question. There has got to be a designer.
From a personal point of view, what I see is a vast sea of limitations, and from a theological point of view, what I see is God everywhere.
Well, I see the hand of a designer who has a purpose for us, and I think about the language in which he's written that to us, a language we can understand.
I see a great proof of the existence of God because I see a wonderful system that to me would not have any reason or even explanation of existence without the intervention of a supreme being. And this supreme being, we call it God.
I do see and a complexity and interactivity that is just awesome to me. It makes me, when I think about it, when I let myself think about it, I just become awestruck at the way things are put together.
If you ask, is it reasonable scientifically to believe that organisms are intelligently designed, that a pre-existing intelligence, a creator, whatever you want to call it, brought about these things by the application of intelligence? The answer is, not only is that reasonable, all the scientific evidence really points to that. It's only prejudice, materialistic, naturalistic prejudice on the part of the scientific materialists that makes them blind to this reality that's trying to speak to them, that's trying to tell them how things really are.
The observation of the intelligent design of life, says Behe, is as momentous as the observation that the earth goes round the sun. Rest assured, the science establishment and their friends in the media cannot suppress this kind of news forever.
More and more of them are learning. People are teaching their young people. More and more I hear on the internet and elsewhere from evolutionary biology teachers in college that they don't know what to do with the students that are coming in, because so many of them just won't believe the old stories. They tell them about the peppered moth. They tell them the peppered moth proves it all, and the students say, we know about that. First place, it's a fake, and in the second place, it wouldn't prove anything important even if it were true. Well, how can we deal with this? You see? And they don't believe the finchbeak story either, or they don't think it's important. When we tell them about the fossils, they say, yes, but have you looked at the fossil record as a whole? Have you done fair-minded investigation of whether the fossil record as a whole supports your theory? Well, they never heard of such a concept. Who would want to do a thing like that? Fair-minded investigation. You look for confirming examples. That's how we do it in this science. So they've got their backs to the wall. And it's very interesting that they have to rely almost entirely on their authority as authority figures. But again, that's not true scientific thinking. True scientific thinking has to be prepared for a real revolution. And I believe that one is coming.
One is coming, indeed. History, says noted biologist Lynn Margulis, will record neo-Darwinism as a minor 20th century religious sect. While Christianity has endured for 2,000 years, and Judaism longer still, Darwinism will not last 200. In the endless struggle of ideas, the truth will always prevail.